The HOA reported my cabin generator, thinking they had power over me, but the moment it roared to life, the entire neighborhood lit up, and their complaint went dark. The rain had started just before sundown, a thin, steady drizzle that whispered against rooftops and turned the asphalt into a mirror of rippling gray. By the time the clock struck 8, Pine Creek had sunk into silence. Then, without warning, the world went dark. Streetlights flickered once, then died. Porch lamps blinked out one by one, leaving the neighborhood in a heavy, unnatural quiet. Inside his modest cabin at the edge of the cul-de-sac, Ethan Cole sat by the window, a mug of steaming coffee in his hands. His generator hummed softly behind the house, a low, rhythmic sound that cut through the stillness like a heartbeat. From where he sat, he could see the rest of the neighborhood swallowed in blackness. Windows that had glowed moments ago were now hollow squares of shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm chirped weakly and fell silent. Then came the shouting. Ethan set his mug down and leaned forward. Through the curtain, he saw flashlights bobbing in the fog, their beams cutting across the street like frantic searchlights. The voices grew louder, angry and confused, until one broke through them all. Sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. "Cole! I know you're in there." Ethan didn't need to look twice. That voice belonged to Greg Masters, the self-proclaimed HOA president for life. Even in the dim glow of flashlights, Greg's outline was distinct, tall, broad-shouldered, and overdressed for the weather, his reflective vest gleaming with authority he had given himself. Around him stood several residents, clutching umbrellas and muttering among themselves. Greg jabbed a finger toward the cabin's glowing windows. "You're violating community power regulations. That generator is unauthorized equipment." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had expected this. Greg's obsession with control had been building for weeks, ever since he'd seen the generator delivered to Ethan's property. The man had filed complaint after complaint, citing visual disruption and noise violations. When that didn't work, he'd threatened fines and legal action. And now, in the middle of a blackout, Greg had brought an audience. Ethan opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The rain had lightened, misting against his coat as he faced the crowd. "Evening, Greg," he said calmly. "Looks like you're having a power problem." Greg's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games, Cole. You know this neighborhood runs under strict regulations. No independent power sources without HOA approval." "Approval," Ethan repeated, his voice even. "Right. And you denied mine because it clashed with the community aesthetic." He gestured toward the darkened street. "Seems like the aesthetic isn't working too well tonight." A few neighbors chuckled softly, earning a glare from Greg. "This isn't a joke," he barked. "You're endangering the entire community with that thing. If it overloads the system, we could have fires." Ethan cut him off, his tone cool but firm. "Greg, my generator is fully insulated. It's been inspected, tested, and approved by the county before your HOA even existed. It's not connected to your grid. It's off-grid, self-contained." Greg stepped closer, rain dripping from his jacket. "That's what you claim. But I'm reporting you to the state inspector first thing in the morning." Ethan tilted his head slightly, a faint smile forming. "You already did." This morning, actually, Greg's expression faltered. "What?" "I got the call from the inspector around noon," Ethan continued, his eyes steady. "He said you'd filed a complaint. Funny thing, he also said he checked my setup himself 3 months ago when Pine Creek first applied for grid certification. He's the one who helped me install the system safely." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Greg's jaw tightened. "You're lying." "Am I?" Ethan asked softly. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the one in the dark." A flicker of unease crossed Greg's face. He turned toward the street, scanning the silent rows of houses. The entire community was without power, all except Ethan's cabin, whose warm golden light glowed steadily through the mist. The sound of the generator filled the air, smooth and constant, while the rest of Pine Creek stood helpless in blackout. One of the neighbors, Mr. Patterson, stepped forward. "Greg, shouldn't we be figuring out why the power's out instead of arguing with him?" "It's freezing out here." Greg ignored him. "You think you're clever, Cole," he said, voice low. "You think this little stunt makes you look like a hero?" Ethan crossed his arms. "No." Just prepared, Greg turned back to the crowd, trying to regain control. Listen, everyone. This is exactly why we have regulations. People like him think they're above the rules. He's using unauthorized energy equipment. That's why we've got an outage. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're saying my generator caused your blackout? Interesting theory. You might want to check the substation on Ridgeway first. You remember? The one your board delayed maintenance on for 3 months to cut costs? Greg's face flushed red. Watch your mouth. But now the whispers were louder. A few residents pulled out their phones, shaking their heads as they scrolled through outage alerts. One man muttered, "He's right. It says the Ridgeway substation tripped." City maintenance issue. Another sighed. Figures. Greg never submitted the budget for upgrades. Ethan didn't need to say another word. The truth was spreading on its own. Greg's flashlight trembled in his hand. "I'll have your generator seized," he snapped. "Mark my words, Cole. You're finished here." Ethan stepped back toward his door, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to try. But Greg, you might want to think twice before you go after the only working power source in Pine Creek right now." He closed the door gently, leaving the crowd outside in silence. Inside, the cabin felt almost peaceful. The hum of the generator mixed with the soft ticking of a wall clock. Ethan took another sip of his coffee, now lukewarm, and glanced toward a small monitor on his desk. The security cameras outside were still recording, capturing every word, every threat, every lie. He clicked a few keys, saving the footage to a secure folder. A small smile played at his lips. Greg Masters thought tonight was his victory, that he'd caught Ethan breaking a rule. But what he didn't realize was that the blackout wasn't a coincidence. Something had triggered it. Something connected to the very grid Greg claimed to control. Ethan looked out the window once more. Greg stood in the fog, still shouting orders no one was following. The street was darker than ever, the only light coming from the cabin, steady, unwavering, defiant. Ethan whispered to himself, "You should have left it alone, Greg." He took another slow sip, the reflection of his cabin light gleaming in his eyes. He didn't gloat. He just smiled, because Greg had no idea that by trying to destroy him, he was about to destroy himself, and that generator he hated so much. It was about to expose everything. Greg Masters had a way of making everything about him. Even before he became the self-proclaimed president of the Pine Creek Homeowners Association, he walked around as if the entire neighborhood was his stage, and everyone else were unwilling actors in his show. He wore crisp polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched on the chest, a logo he designed himself, and carried a leather clipboard everywhere he went like it was a badge of office. He loved rules, but more than that, he loved being the one who made them. He wasn't elected. The truth was simpler and more sinister. When Pine Creek's original HOA president retired, Greg, who had been the secretary at the time, quietly amended the association's charter, creating a temporary leadership clause. That clause made him acting president until a proper election could be arranged. But the election never happened, and by the time anyone realized it, Greg had already built a network of loyal board members who owed him favors, men who feared losing their comfortable positions. Ethan Cole had moved to Pine Creek for peace and solitude. His small cabin on the edge of the community was a retreat from city noise, a place surrounded by pine trees and open sky. He paid his dues, followed the rules, and kept to himself. But his independence, the fact that he didn't rely on Greg's carefully managed systems, made him stand out. It began subtly. One morning, Ethan found a bright orange envelope stuck to his door. Notice of violation, improper landscaping. Greg claimed that the pine needles scattered across Ethan's driveway created a safety hazard. Ethan swept them up and thought nothing more of it. But a week later, another envelope appeared. Unauthorized structure, wooden shed, non-compliant with community standards. That shed had been standing for years, built long before the HOA was formed. Ethan confronted Greg about it at the next meeting, held in the sterile community center that Greg liked to call Town Hall. Rows of folding chairs faced a podium where Greg stood beneath a banner that read, "Pine Creek, Order, Beauty, and Unity." "Mr. Masters," Ethan began, keeping his tone calm, "you fined me for a shed that's been on my property since the subdivision was built. The original developer even approved it. Greg smiled tightly, his voice smooth as glass. Regulations evolve, Mr. Cole. The HOA reserves the right to reassess structures that no longer meet aesthetic standards. Aesthetic, Ethan repeated, frowning. It's behind my house. No one can even see it. Visibility isn't the issue, Greg said, flipping through his clipboard. Consistency is. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. They all knew Greg's game, but none dared challenge him. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You're not enforcing consistency. You're enforcing control. Greg's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Careful, Mr. Cole. You wouldn't want to appear uncooperative. The board keeps records. That was the first time Ethan saw what lay beneath Greg's polished exterior, the quiet threat that kept everyone obedient. Over the next few weeks, Greg's harassment escalated. He began sending routine inspection notices to Ethan's home, always citing vague concerns. Exterior equipment check, noise level monitoring, unauthorized lighting. Once, Ethan came home to find Greg standing in his driveway, taking photos of his windows. Afternoon, Cole, Greg said cheerfully, lowering his phone. Just updating our property database. Ethan folded his arms. You have no right to photograph my home. Actually, I do, Greg replied, tapping his clipboard. Community Oversight Policy, Section 8, Paragraph 3. That paragraph refers to shared spaces, Ethan countered immediately. Driveways and mailboxes. My cabin is private property. Greg hesitated, then smiled again. That same cold, rehearsed smile. Well, we'll let the board interpret that. That night, Ethan reviewed the HOA handbook. Section 8 contained no such paragraph. Greg had made it up. It was then Ethan realized that Greg didn't follow the rules. He was the rules. Greg's tactics grew bolder. He sent false noise complaints, claiming Ethan's generator disturbed the neighborhood. Yet, when Ethan checked his security footage, it showed nothing but silence. He filed a formal protest, attaching the video evidence. Days later, the HOA's online complaint system mysteriously deleted his submission. At the next HOA meeting, Greg announced new restrictions on off-grid power systems, citing community harmony and safety. Ethan knew it was directed at him. When he tried to speak, Greg interrupted. Mr. Cole, we've heard enough from you on this issue, Greg said, raising his hand. You seem to think you're above the standards that apply to everyone else. I just want fairness, Ethan replied. That's all anyone wants here. Greg leaned forward, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. Fairness? His eyes glinted. Fairness is what I decide it is. From that moment on, the feud was no longer professional. It was personal. Greg began calling Ethan the hermit in community emails, mocking his independence. He whispered to other board members that Ethan was unstable and secretive. He even manipulated a few neighbors into filing complaints against Ethan, promising them reduced dues in return. The pattern was clear. Greg wanted Ethan isolated and discredited. But something strange happened. The more Greg pushed, the more the neighborhood started noticing the cracks in his rule. People began questioning fines they never understood, fees that seemed to appear from nowhere. A few quietly approached Ethan, asking for advice on how to appeal their citations. Ethan didn't plan revenge, not yet, but he did start keeping records. Every notice, every letter, every false claim. He built a file so detailed it could rival the HOA's own archives. And in that file, he found something unexpected, a discrepancy in the HOA's financial statements. Greg had been transferring administrative funds into a private account under a consulting firm's name, Masters Development Group. Ethan didn't confront him immediately. He waited, watching as Greg's arrogance grew unchecked. Because deep down, he knew that tyrants fall hardest when they think they're untouchable. Greg Masters believed he owned Pine Creek, that his clipboard and charm made him invincible. But the truth was he'd already built the foundation of his downfall. Greg's obsession wasn't about rules anymore. It was about breaking a man who refused to bow to him. He didn't know who he was picking a fight with. The sky was a roiling mass of gray clouds, and the air carried the electric tang of an approaching storm. Pine Creek had been humid all afternoon, and now the wind whistled through the tall pines surrounding Ethan's cabin. Rain began to lash against the roof, each droplet striking like tiny hammers, making the wooden siding shudder under the sudden assault. Ethan had been monitoring his generator all evening, noting the stable hum that had kept his cabin lit despite the heavy clouds. He had a quiet satisfaction in watching the shadows of the woods sway under the flickering porch light, a calm contrast to the storm brewing outside. That calm shattered with the sudden roar of tires on wet pavement. Ethan looked up just as headlights cut through the mist, blinding in their intensity. A black SUV skidded to a stop at the end of his driveway. The door swung open, and there he was, Greg Masters, standing tall and rigid in his rain-soaked jacket, a clipboard clutched like a weapon in his hand. Two men followed him, both wearing nondescript black suits but carrying badges that identified them as HOA enforcement officers. "You!" Greg shouted, his voice piercing through the pattering rain. "I've had enough of your blatant disregard for community rules." Ethan stepped onto the porch, hands in his coat pockets, eyes steady. "Evening, Greg." Quite a storm to be delivering citations. "This isn't about the weather, Cole," Greg snapped, stepping closer. Water dripped from the brim of his perfectly styled hair, but he didn't seem to care. "It's about your generator." Unauthorized electrical equipment. A fire hazard, Ethan raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of amusement on his face. "A fire hazard? You mean this?" He gestured toward the generator that hummed softly behind his cabin. "It's insulated, code approved, and has run flawlessly for years. You've never once cited me for safety inspections before." Greg's lip curled into a smug grin. "Times change. Community standards change. And your cabin is non-compliant." One of the officers stepped forward, a clipboard shaking slightly in his hands. "Sir, we can—" "Do your job," Greg barked, cutting him off. "Disconnect the unit from the local power grid immediately." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I'm not connected to your grid. That's the point of being off-grid." Greg didn't blink. "I made arrangements." "Inspector Holt is on his way." Ethan's stomach tightened. Inspector Holt was notorious for bending rules if the right bribes were offered, and Greg had apparently already made sure the inspector would support his citations. Ethan glanced at his own network of cameras and sensors. He wasn't worried yet, but the storm outside and the presence of Greg and his officers made the cabin feel suddenly vulnerable. Moments later, headlights appeared again, this time smaller, belonging to the inspector's unmarked van. Inspector Holt stepped out, umbrella in hand, smiling like a man expecting a gift. He nodded at Greg, who returned the gesture with smug triumph. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," Holt said, voice oily and polite. "We're here to ensure compliance." Ethan didn't respond. He simply moved to the generator, checking gauges and noting amperages. Everything was within operational limits. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "there is nothing unsafe about this system." Greg waved a hand, clearly ignoring him. "We'll see about that." Disconnect it. Now the officers moved toward the generator, but Ethan stepped in front of it. "I can't allow that." "You're tampering with private property." Greg's expression darkened. "I have the authority under HOA mandate and the inspector's approval. You will comply." Ethan's lips pressed together. He didn't panic. Instead, he flicked a few switches and leaned against the generator, listening closely as the subtle vibrations carried through the cabin. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I'm watching." The inspector raised his eyebrows and muttered something about resisting enforcement, then gestured to the officers. They hesitated, perhaps sensing that Ethan knew more than they did. Holt nodded, then began scribbling in his clipboard. After a few minutes, the officers reluctantly reached for the cables connecting the generator to the community maintenance line. Ethan's heart beat a little faster. The line had been installed years ago, part of a backup system that supplied emergency energy to Pine Creek, a system Greg had never been informed about. He had installed it when he still worked for Northgate Energy, testing redundant circuits that could feed critical infrastructure during outages. Only he knew the full scope of its reach. As the cables were pulled, a sudden silence fell over the cabin. The generator hummed steadily, but Ethan could sense the tension outside. Then, without warning, a strange flicker moved through the neighborhood. Streetlights blinked, then died. One by one, homes along the cul-de-sac plunged into darkness. The rain blurred the silhouettes of confused neighbors as they stumbled out of their houses, flashlights darting in panicked arcs. Greg's face went pale. What's happening?" he stammered, glancing from one darkened house to the next. "This can't be," one of the neighbors yelled from across the street. "Ethan's cabin!" "Only his lights are on." A murmur spread through the gathering crowd. People peeked out from their doorways, some clutching children, others gripping umbrellas, all staring at the single-lit cabin like it held a secret power. Greg's confident posture faltered as whispers grew louder. "How can this be his fault?" one resident muttered. "He's the only one with power." Ethan remained calm, watching through the camera monitors that captured every moment outside. Greg fumbled with his clipboard, trying to assert authority, but no one seemed to pay attention. Every accusation he made was now met with suspicion. The blackout wasn't just a technical failure. It was a revelation. Greg's voice rose, cracking with desperation. This isn't over, Cole. You're going to pay for this." Ethan leaned back against the generator, fingers brushing the edge of the control panel. "I don't think you understand, Greg. By shutting off the connection, you just tripped the emergency feed, the one I installed years ago. You're responsible for the entire neighborhood going dark." Greg's mouth opened, then closed. That's impossible." Ethan's monitor showed live footage of the substation lines, where his generator had been quietly taking over critical circuits. The system was stable, and his cabin remained fully powered. He could see the panic in Greg's face through the cameras, the realization that his plan had catastrophically backfired. The storm intensified. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the chaos outside. Neighbors shouted at one another, some trying to call the city power line, others shaking their fists at Greg. The rain soaked through everyone's clothes, but no one seemed to care. The sight of their helplessness in front of Ethan's small but steadfast cabin was all-consuming. Greg stumbled back, muttering threats under his breath. It can't be." Ethan calmly picked up his coffee, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip. "You made your biggest mistake tonight, Greg," he said softly, almost to himself, as he pressed a button to begin recording the entire event. Every word, every gesture, every misstep from Greg and his team was being documented. From the porch, he could hear neighbors' astonished voices. "I don't get it. His lights are still on." Greg turned toward the crowd, face red with anger and embarrassment. "It's him. It's all his fault. He's breaking the rules." A neighbor, shaking his head in disbelief, whispered, "If he's breaking rules, why is he the only one with power?" Ethan didn't move. He didn't gloat. The generator hummed steadily, its soft mechanical heartbeat drowning out the storm and Greg's furious shouts. Every shadow cast by the flickering streetlights outside seemed to point back toward him, highlighting his calm control amid the chaos. The moment stretched, tense and electric. Greg's threats lost their bite as reality settled over the street. Residents began to murmur among themselves, questioning his authority. Ethan's preparation, his foresight and quiet patience, had turned Greg's attack against him. Ethan watched, eyes sharp behind the glow of his monitors. Every action was documented, every accusation captured, every misstep logged. He knew this night would be remembered. Not for the storm, not for the blackout, but for the undeniable proof that Greg Masters had overreached. And as the rain poured, lightning flashed, and neighbors shouted in confusion and awe, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction. Greg had believed he was untouchable. He had acted recklessly, illegally, and arrogantly. And now, he was about to learn the consequences. Ethan exhaled slowly, the hum of the generator filling the cabin like a victorious song. He didn't gloat. He just smiled, quietly collecting every moment on his security cameras. Greg had just made his biggest mistake. Ethan Cole sat in his cabin late at night, the storm finally easing into a gentle drizzle. The hum of his generator was constant, a soft mechanical lullaby that filled the quiet cabin. To anyone who had seen him in the past few weeks, he might have appeared like just another reclusive neighbor, quietly tending to his property. But behind the calm demeanor, a carefully constructed network of technology, knowledge, and strategy had been quietly operating, preparing for the moment that Greg Masters' arrogance would outpace his caution. Greg had no idea that Ethan wasn't just the hermit at the edge of Pine Creek. Before retiring, Ethan had been an electrical systems engineer for Northgate Energy, the very company that built the infrastructure supporting the entire community. His experience wasn't theoretical. It was practical, hands-on, and deeply comprehensive. Years ago, as a personal project, he had installed a hybrid prototype generator in his cabin, capable of functioning independently while feeding into a carefully designed community backup grid. When the HOA and Greg Masters appeared on the scene, it had been only a matter of time before the setup would prove invaluable. Every action Greg had taken against Ethan, from false citations to surprise inspections, from forged noise complaints to attempts at intimidation, had been quietly recorded. Cameras positioned around the cabin's exterior captured video of each encounter in high definition. Motion sensors logged every unauthorized approach. Even conversations that took place in the yard or near the driveway were recorded through directional microphones hidden in plain sight, all feeding into a secure cloud system, automatically timestamping and encrypting every file. Ethan wasn't merely defending himself, he was constructing a dossier of undeniable proof. The days following the blackout were critical. As Greg fumed over his failure, Ethan reached out quietly to other neighbors. One by one, men who had suffered under Greg's arbitrary fines and relentless scrutiny came forward. Mr. Patterson, whose front lawn had been fined twice for irregular edging, recounted his experience on video. Another, a retired schoolteacher named Linde, spoke of a fine for parking a delivery truck overnight, despite being in compliance with city regulations. Each testimony was meticulously cataloged, accompanied by timestamps, receipts, and supporting documents. Ethan smiled faintly as he watched the footage compile. Every word, every look of frustration from Greg, every overreach of authority was neatly recorded, ready to be presented when the time was right. But he didn't act hastily. He allowed Greg to think he had gained the upper hand. The HOA tyrant had attempted a new tactic, forging a safety violation report claiming Ethan's generator was a fire hazard severe enough to warrant eviction. Ethan reviewed the forged report, noting the altered dates, falsified signatures, and inconsistencies. Rather than responding immediately, he let the document linger in the inbox he had created specifically to monitor Greg's activity. It was a subtle psychological maneuver. Allow the adversary to believe they've scored a victory while all evidence of their misdeeds is being duplicated, encrypted, and sent to external authorities. By the next morning, Ethan had already forwarded copies of Greg's forged report, along with the audio recordings of his threats and intimidation, to the City Council and the State Housing Bureau. Every move Greg made against him had become a liability, a potential weapon in Ethan's hands. Ethan's next step was decisive. He sent formal invitations to the entire HOA board for a power restoration meeting at the Pine Creek Community Hall. Each email emphasized urgency, Greg's responsibility, and the need for all members to attend. Greg, as usual, assumed the position of authority and accepted the invitation with pride, envisioning himself at the head of the table, ready to lecture and intimidate. He had no inkling that the room would not only be fully illuminated, but that the energy would come entirely from Ethan's generator system, bypassing the city grid entirely. The day of the meeting arrived, crisp and overcast. Ethan arrived early, quietly inspecting the hall while technicians, his discreet colleagues from his engineering past, double-checked connections and systems. Every outlet, every light fixture, every projector and microphone had been tested. A backup line ensured that even if someone attempted tampering, the room would remain powered and every moment would be logged. When the board members filed in, Greg walked with his usual confidence, clipboard in hand, chest puffed as if the storm from 2 nights ago had never happened. "Gentlemen," he began, voice loud and commanding, "this meeting is about ensuring safe and proper operation of all electrical equipment in the community." Ethan remained in the shadows near the control panel at the back of the room, observing, waiting. His eyes flicked across each board member as they murmured among themselves, unaware of the subtle vibrations in the floor from the generator powering the room. He noticed the small signs of unease, fingers tapping nervously on tables, quick glances exchanged over shoulder, the faint tightening of jaws. Greg's aura of authority was beginning to crack under the weight of anticipation he didn't understand. When the lights flicked on, it was instantaneous. bright and steady, drawing all attention to the projector at the front of the room. Ethan pressed a single button. The screen illuminated, displaying a compilation of Greg's own actions. Security camera footage showing him trespassing and photographing Ethan's property, audio clips of threats and intimidation, falsified reports with clear evidence of forgery, and documents highlighting financial mismanagement within the HOA. Every frame, every recording, every annotation had been meticulously prepared. Gasps filled the room. Greg's mouth opened, then closed, a fish caught out of water. This can't be... Ethan's voice echoed clearly through the hall's speaker system, calm, composed, commanding attention. It's all here, Greg. Every violation, every threat, every forged document. You believed your actions were secret, that your power over Pine Creek was absolute. But every move you made has been recorded, verified, and reported. The room was tense. Board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other as the weight of evidence became undeniable. Greg's face flushed, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and fear. He jabbed at the screen. You can't do this!" Ethan stepped forward, eyes locked on him. "I didn't do anything illegal, Greg." "You did. You thought your position and arrogance would protect you. Instead, it made your actions transparent. Every forged safety report, every illegal attempt to disconnect power, every intimidation tactic, it's all here for the city council and state authorities to review." Greg stammered, grasping at his clipboard as if it were a lifeline. This is not admissible. You're... Ethan held up a hand. "I didn't go behind the law. I simply recorded what happened and reported it. That's all anyone should do when faced with someone abusing authority." The murmurs in the room swelled into whispers of outrage. "He's telling the truth," one member said quietly. "I've seen him document things before." Another nodded. "Those reports of mine he helped confirm. Greg was exaggerating, even falsifying." Greg's eyes darted around the room, panic setting in. His well-rehearsed confidence evaporated as he realized that every insult, every violation, every attempt to assert dominance had been catalogued. Even the HOA members he relied upon for support now looked uncertain, some exchanging worried glances, others clutching their own copies of emails and reports confirming Ethan's account. The projector shifted to display charts of energy distribution throughout the neighborhood, highlighting that Ethan's cabin had remained a source of stability during the blackout. It was a subtle but undeniable revelation. While Greg attempted to assert control over power, it had been Ethan's foresight and skill that had kept the community afloat. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Greg's voice broke, small and frantic. You can't." Ethan stepped closer, voice steady. "It's over, Greg. The city council, the state housing bureau, and even your own HOA members now have the evidence. Every illegal action you took, all of it, is documented. The choice to comply or contest is no longer yours alone." For the first time, the man who believed himself untouchable felt the weight of consequences bearing down. He sank into his chair at the head of the table, gripping the edge as his arrogance gave way to fear and disbelief. The board members exchanged nods, some whispering quietly about next steps, some glaring at Greg with the realization that they had been complicit by silence. Ethan stepped back, watching the scene unfold. The lights of the room, powered entirely by his system, reflected evenly across the faces of everyone present. Every projector slide, every audio clip, every piece of evidence had played out exactly as he had foreseen. He had allowed Greg to think he was still in control, to believe that his forged documents and threats would intimidate. Yet, in reality, every step had brought Greg closer to his ultimate exposure. As the room settled into stunned silence, Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. His cabin, his generator, and his meticulous preparation had created the perfect stage for justice. Greg Masters, the man who thought he owned Pine Creek, now faced undeniable evidence of his own misdeeds. The lights of the community hall remained bright and unwavering, a symbol of the control Greg had failed to grasp, the control Ethan had quietly and strategically wielded all along. Ethan didn't gloat. He just smiled, because Greg had no idea that by trying to destroy him, he was about to destroy himself. And that generator he hated so much? It was about to expose everything. The Pine Creek Community Hall was tense, every chair occupied by board members, concerned neighbors, and a few city officials who had been discreetly informed about the day's proceedings. Rain pelted the windows in steady streams, echoing like drums on the roof above. At the head of the long conference table sat Greg Masters, his face a mask of authority and smug satisfaction. His fingers drummed impatiently against the wood surface, and his gaze swept the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. "This meeting is called to address the recent blackout," he barked, voice echoing sharply. "I will not tolerate misinformation. Someone must answer for the disruption in our community." Ethan Cole, standing near the rear of the room, remained calm. His posture was relaxed, but every sense was alert. He had spent weeks orchestrating this exact moment, and the evidence was ready to unfold. The hum of the room's lighting, fully powered by his hidden generator, seemed to pulse with quiet authority. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the storm outside had followed them indoors, carrying the electricity of imminent revelation. Greg continued, pacing in front of the table. "Ethan, you will explain why your generator supposedly interfered with the neighborhood's power. You alone are responsible for the blackout, and you will be held accountable." His eyes glinted with arrogance, convinced that everyone would bow to his version of events. Ethan stepped forward, holding a small remote control in his hand. "Of course, Greg," he said evenly, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had unnerved him throughout their conflict. "I'll explain exactly what happened." Greg's lips curled into a condescending smirk. Finally, "Speak up, cabin guy. Tell us how you caused chaos while pretending to follow the rules." Ethan pressed the button. Immediately the room's lighting dimmed, and the projector flickered to life. The screen illuminated with crisp, high-definition video, security camera footage from Ethan's cabin and surrounding streets. The first clips showed Greg approaching the cabin during the storm, clipboard in hand, shouting threats and waving the forged documents that had been the foundation of his intimidation. Next came clips of him cutting wires, his hands deliberate and precise, pretending to enforce regulations while attempting sabotage. Gasps filled the room. The faces of neighbors turned pale as the truth unfolded on screen. Men who had endured Greg's relentless harassment whispered to each other, disbelief mingling with relief. "I knew he was overstepping," one man murmured, eyes fixed on the screen. "But I didn't realize how far he'd go." Ethan didn't pause. He clicked the remote again, transitioning to the audio recordings he had secretly captured over the weeks. The speakers carried Greg's voice with chilling clarity. "I'll get rid of the cabin guy for good. No one will ever defy me and walk away." The tone was arrogant, almost gleeful in its malice. Each threat, each boast, hung in the room like smoke, suffocating Greg's previously unshakable confidence. Greg's face turned crimson. He stammered, attempting to defend himself. This isn't legal, you can't." At that precise moment, a pair of uniformed officers entered silently through the side door. One handcuffed the city inspector who had been bribed by Greg, ensuring the room's accomplice could not interfere. The inspector's expression was one of stunned resignation, eyes darting nervously between the officers and the display screen, realizing that his involvement had been exposed. Ethan walked toward the head of the table, maintaining a calm and steady pace. He stopped in front of Greg, who now gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The crowd in the hall fell silent, the tension palpable. Rain continued to hammer the windows, but inside, a storm of a different kind had erupted, the storm of truth, evidence, and justice. "You wanted power, Greg," Ethan said softly, but with a clear, commanding presence. "Now you can have it, behind bars." The projector rotated through a series of documents, forged reports, financial mismanagement records, and correspondence revealing multiple attempts at bribery and intimidation. Board members shifted uncomfortably, some whispering urgently to each other. The room's energy shifted from tense confusion to collective realization. Greg's aura of control, so carefully cultivated over the years, was unraveling in real time. The neighbors who had endured his arbitrary fines, men fined for mowing their lawns an inch too high, for leaving porch lights on, or for harmless renovations, exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. "He's been lying to us all this time," one said. Another muttered, All those threats. He made us fear him, but it was all manipulation. Greg's voice rose, cracking with desperation. This evidence is fabricated. You can't prove anything. His eyes darted around, looking for allies, but the board members avoided his gaze. Even the city officials present showed no sign of support. The carefully constructed facade of authority had crumbled. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply pressed another button, and the screen displayed a timeline of the blackout, overlaying it with Ethan's generator system. Lines traced the flow of energy, showing clearly that his cabin had been the only source of stability during the community-wide outage. The irony was unmistakable. The man who sought to dominate the neighborhood's power infrastructure had failed, while the very person he tried to undermine had ensured the community's survival. Greg's fists pounded the table, shaking it. You can't do this! I am the HOA! You are accountable, Greg. Ethan interrupted, voice calm, unwavering. Every illegal action, every threat, every forged document, all of it has been documented and submitted to the appropriate authorities. You believed your position made you untouchable, but your own arrogance has proven otherwise. The officer who had handcuffed the inspector now approached Greg. Sir, you are under arrest for fraud, tampering with electrical systems, and multiple counts of harassment and intimidation, he said, reading from a prepared statement. Greg's mouth opened, then closed, struggling for words that would not come. The room's attention was fixed entirely on him, the once dominant HOA tyrant reduced to a man trembling under the weight of consequences he had refused to foresee. Ethan stepped back slightly, allowing the officers to guide Greg out. He turned toward the board and the neighbors, who were now murmuring among themselves, the tension slowly shifting to relief and satisfaction. The blackout was not caused by defiance or by negligence, Ethan said. It was caused by the truth finally catching up with arrogance. Every violation, every threat, every attempt at manipulation has been exposed. The HOA's license is now suspended, all fines overturned, and the responsible parties have been brought to justice. As Greg was led out of the hall, the neighbors began to clap quietly at first, then louder as the reality of the moment sank in. Some shook their heads, still processing how one man's cunning and preparation had turned the tide against years of tyranny. Board members nodded, gratitude and respect evident in their expressions. Ethan didn't celebrate. He observed quietly, letting the moment speak for itself. The lights remained steady, powered entirely by his hidden system. The projector had revealed not just evidence, but a lesson. That abuse of authority, no matter how carefully cultivated, would eventually meet accountability. The city inspector, still handcuffed, avoided eye contact with anyone, knowing his complicity had sealed his fate. Board members quietly discussed plans to restructure and ensure oversight, their focus now on preventing future abuse. Neighbors began leaving the hall, talking in hushed tones about the events they had just witnessed, a mixture of shock, relief, and newfound hope. Ethan collected his remote and stepped toward the doorway, his calm demeanor unbroken. The storm outside had passed entirely, leaving the crisp scent of rain and the soft whisper of wind. He paused for a moment, looking back at the room, the empty chairs, and the projector screen still glowing with the undeniable evidence of Greg's downfall. He had done what he needed to do, quietly, meticulously, and without fanfare. The tyrant of Pine Creek had been exposed, and the community was free to rebuild on principles of fairness and justice rather than fear. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of weeks of careful planning lift slightly from his shoulders. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself, and the consequences had unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. He just smiled, because Greg had no idea that by trying to destroy him, he was about to destroy himself, and that generator he hated so much. It was about to expose everything. Weeks had passed since Greg Masters' downfall, yet Pine Creek still felt the aftershocks of the chaos he had wrought. The streets, once silent under the weight of his authority, now hummed with quiet energy. Residents emerged from their homes during late afternoons and weekends, armed with paintbrushes, tools, and an unfamiliar sense of ownership. Fences were repaired, lawns freshly mowed, and colorful flower boxes appeared on windowsills, turning the neighborhood into a vibrant patchwork of reclaimed individuality. For the first time in years, laughter and conversation replaced the tense silence that Greg had cultivated like a shadow over every corner of Pine Creek. Ethan watched from his porch, the soft glow of his cabin's lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. The generator that had once made him a target now symbolized the community's resilience. Engineers from the city had officially inspected and certified the system, declaring it capable of handling emergencies for the entire neighborhood. The main housing box had been engraved in polished metal, in service of Pine Creek, Ethan Cole. Residents passing by offered nods of appreciation, some waving with genuine warmth. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. The very device Greg had despised, the source of his obsession and contempt, now powered not just his home but the collective heartbeat of the community. The new resident committee, formed after the HOA's license was permanently suspended, worked to institute fairness and transparency. Meetings were collaborative, with decisions made collectively rather than dictated by one man's ego. The boardroom at the community hall, once a chamber of intimidation, now echoed with voices discussing landscaping projects, emergency preparedness, and neighborhood events. Greg's policies, the fines for trivial offenses, the arbitrary rules, the overreaching surveillance, had been abolished entirely. Pine Creek was finally free from tyranny. News about Greg's personal collapse circulated quietly but relentlessly. He had lost his home in foreclosure, his reputation obliterated, and every connection he had relied upon for his authority severed. Rumors claimed he had taken a night shift position at the very energy company he had mocked Ethan for joining, performing menial labor while former colleagues he had belittled passed him in the hallways with barely concealed smirks. Ethan, however, did not take pleasure in these details. There was no gloating in his demeanor, only satisfaction that justice had prevailed and that the community had healed. One crisp evening, Ethan sat back in his rocking chair, a mug of steaming coffee warming his hands. The sky above Pine Creek was dotted with stars, the quiet hum of his generator blending with the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant bark of a dog. The lights across the neighborhood flickered on in sequence, street lamps, porches, and homes all illuminated as the generator balanced the power load perfectly. Ethan took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He had faced harassment, deceit, and a man who believed his power was absolute. Yet through patience, strategy, and expertise, he had ensured not only his survival, but the prosperity of everyone around him. A neighbor jogged past, pausing to wave. "Thanks, Ethan. The lights are amazing. No more outages." His tone carried gratitude and relief, a contrast to the fear that had lingered during Greg's reign. Ethan nodded and returned the wave, silently acknowledging the collective effort and trust that had now defined the community. As he sipped his coffee, Ethan thought back to the stormy night when Greg had tried to cut his power, confident that he could assert dominance through intimidation and threats. Instead, that very attempt had revealed the full scope of Ethan's preparation and knowledge. What had begun as a personal defense had transformed into a cornerstone for the neighborhood's safety and independence. Every wire, every system, every calculated move had ensured that Greg's hubris would have consequences far beyond the man himself. From the porch, Ethan could see Pine Creek thriving, children running across lawns without fear, neighbors talking across fences, and families gathering on porches under the soft glow of fully restored lights. There was peace now, the kind that could only exist when trust replaced fear and when those who once ruled through intimidation were removed from the equation. The generator thrummed steadily, a quiet heartbeat for the entire community, a reminder of foresight, persistence, and justice. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. He didn't need accolades or public recognition. The steady lights and the laughter of neighbors were reward enough. He understood the irony fully. Greg had tried to cut his power, to diminish his influence, to assert control over a man he underestimated. Yet, in an ultimate twist of fate, that same generator now ensured that Pine Creek thrived, safe from the whims of a tyrant. Ethan leaned back, feeling the cool night air on his face, and allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The streetlights glowed steadily, casting long, peaceful shadows across driveways and sidewalks. The community had reclaimed its voice, its independence, and its dignity, and in that perfect, electric harmony, Ethan felt the satisfaction of seeing justice served in the most ironic and complete way possible. He didn't gloat. Instead, one quiet evening, as the lights across Pine Creek flickered back to life under my system, I sat on my porch and smiled. Greg had tried to cut my power, and I'd ended up powering everyone else. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of bureaucratic power, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that petty control can lead to unexpected and catastrophic infrastructure failure.